not an unlimited cavity, so we see in this graph that when temperatures start rising beyond the comfort zone of around 25 degrees, that's average temperatures, that those that are sick or elderly, those that are already struggling, are affected. You get increased deaths at this point of time, and while cold also has a similar effect, we have more capacity to actually adapt to the cold. You can put on more clothing. But it's really hard when temperatures hit 50 and you're trying to bring things down to 25. Cities are also problematic with the amount of concrete that's here and asphalt, surfaces that actually absorb heat. It means that at night time it gets re-radiated and everything actually stays really hot. So future urban design is going to have to think about how we keep our cities cooler, how we have more green spaces, where we get better tree canopy. So it's not surprising, actually, that there were deaths from heat waves. In fact, heat waves have killed more people in Australia in the last 100 years than all natural disasters put together. And as I said, they can be particularly devastating when temperatures at night stay high. So I want to talk a little bit about the psychological impacts. Because it's easy to forget things after the fire's gone. And yet, in relation to Black Saturday, 3 to 4 years after the fires, 26% of people in the worst affected areas showed signs of mental health problems beyond levels likely to be manageable and which may require professional support. And we know from other studies that children are likely to be more vulnerable. So, how do rising temperatures relate to more extreme weather, particularly heat waves? Because we start talking about little things like 1 or 2 degrees, and they seem really minuscule. What's 1 or 2 degrees? So the pink line graphs the mean temperature, the average temperature going up. But if you look at the blue scatter points of the range of temperature, that's where things actually start getting really interesting. Because as the trend goes up, so does the range. So that when the average temperature goes up, so does those peak temperatures. Now, if you draw a line across that expresses some threshold that's crossed of extreme temperatures, then all of a sudden you get lots and lots of these peaks appearing when before there was very little. And that's the scary thing about the climate. The changing climate. You get this sudden tipping point where these extreme events start happening much more frequently. So some people would say that we're in the midst of a slow motion emergency, and what we're seeing are simply the symptoms of an underlying cause. And that underlying cause is a warming planet. We should be doing much more than simply managing the symptoms. So what happens even if we manage to keep 2 degrees warming? Well, it's going to get hotter. And projections right now for Sydney and Melbourne by the end of the century put them at 50 degrees. That might occur as early as 2040 if we don't do something about emissions. Perth temperatures will be a bit more like Jurien Bay, 220 kilometres north. And days over 35 degrees will probably double by 2090. For WA, the number of days per year with severe danger weather is projected to nearly double. And by 2030 alone, we think we need to double the amount of fire personnel that actually are on the ground to deal with these issues. Serpentine and Jarrahdale, where the monastery in, over 90% of that is in a bushfire zone. It's concerning. In WA, we're particularly prone. Some people have actually called the Southwest Australia the canary in the mine, the coal mine, in terms of warnings as to what temperatures might do in regards to climate change. And we just simply look at the rainfall projections, the rainfall here from, I can't quite read this now, but they start off in the early 1900s. By 1971, that's that big block here, we're sort of going okay. And then about 1975 onwards, there's a complete drop-off in terms of runoff into Perth dams. And then there's another drop, and we're sitting about here now. So what has happened in terms of runoff, it's gone from 338 gigalitres to 46 gigalitres over this century. And we're expecting by 2030 another 24% drop, by 2090 another 64%. So we're really lucky that we got desal, because we wouldn't be functioning. And Sydney are already contemplating commencing the desal. They've had it actually mothballed, but conditions are getting so bad in New South Wales that they're thinking about actually starting again. I'm going to leave heat for a little while. I'm going to look at other impacts of climate change and maybe consider some other impacts in other parts of the world. So we've really talked more about droughts and wildfires, things around high temperature and more heat waves. I want to talk a little bit about sea level rises. I want to talk about storms and floods, and I want to talk a little bit about what happens when the glaciers melt. I'll talk a little bit about floods and just give you an example of what the impacts of floods actually are. The floods of 2011 in Queensland had really some quite profound health impacts. There were people dying, 2.5 million were affected. In terms of surgeries and what happened in terms of the medical workplace, 1,400 elective surgeries had to be cancelled, and a lot of health infrastructure was damaged. And there was a lot of cost spent in terms of counselling people after the floods, in terms of mental health treatment. Some $38 million was actually spent. A lot of hospitals were isolated, and it took several weeks before things actually settled down. Trying to put some numbers on it, so we're trying to put some numbers on just natural disasters and what it means. So Deloitte's put a report out in 2015 in terms of the social impact from natural disasters. So I'm not talking about infrastructure loss or anything else. I'm talking about some of the costs that relate to increased mental health issues, family violence, alcohol consumption, chronic and non-communicable diseases, short-term unemployment, impacts on community connectedness. While the floods in Queensland produced tangible costs of $6.7 billion, the intangible costs, these other things, was in the vicinity of $7.4 billion. They're sort of ongoing issues that keep percolating. Now, a little bit about what happens in Southeast Asia. And the trouble with the heat is that as the air heats up, the water actually absorbs a chunk of it. And the ocean warming will affect things like coral reefs. Remember the cone shell? It's under threat. But beyond that, what warming does is it causes seawater expansion. So as things get hotter, they expand, and seawater's no different. So at the moment, we've got a 20 centimetre rise. That's largely due to sea level expansion. But the expectation with further warming and glacial melt and ice sheets melting from Greenland and West Antarctica, that sea levels are likely to rise by a further metre. If the Greenland ice sheet has sufficient water to increase sea levels to 6 metres, the Antarctic ice sheets contain enough water to raise levels by 60 metres. A 1 metre rise may displace as many as 37 million people. And the number that would be vulnerable would go up to 60 million if it was a 2 metre rise. And of course, island states are really vulnerable, but there are lots of countries in Southeast Asia that come into an at-risk area. So that's nearly 64,000 square kilometres over 12 countries. We're dependent on glaciers. Many parts of the world are dependent on glacial melting, particularly in the summertime, to continue the supply of water. So the Himalayan glaciers actually supply a lot of water through Asia. And we're expecting to lose a third or half of them by the end of the century. That's 800 million people who are dependent on the meltwaters from them. So, if you add it all together, you can see that we have a problem. It's a problem that's we don't want to a problem that we don't want to have. So I've talked a little bit about the direct effects. I'm just going to quickly brush through go through some other effects. Impacts mediated by changes to natural systems or out of social disruption. Earlier springs, longer summers mean more allergy, things like asthma. It seems a small thing, but if you're an asthmatic, it's a big thing. There's a change regarding changing vectors and diseases and how they're going to behave. So mosquitoes can be confined, or certain species of mosquitoes are confined to a certain temperature range around the equator. But as things get warmer, they could be pushed further south or further north, or go higher as things actually heat up higher up. So you're going to have things like malaria moving into areas where they're not usually seen, for example. And particularly where there's no infrastructure to actually deal with the problem. It's complicated. I don't want to make it too easy because a whole number of things are actually affecting that, including the breeding seasons, rainfall patterns, and patterns of where water are available that mean it's not simple to predict. But we have to think about these things. In terms of food and waterborne diseases, we see it even now that when things warm up, we get more gastroenteritis. It's just bugs breed easier, so you left the food outside from the fridge. The bugs breed up much more quickly. So under current predictions, predicted increases mean that we might get another 200,000 cases of gastroenteritis per year by around 2050, unless we're extremely careful about what we do. And this is the most complex thing to try to describe about the fact that climate change is a threat multiplier. This area of the world is a really unstable part of the world politically. The Sahel has faced massive population growth, and they expect it's going to continue to have massive population growth. It has ongoing issues with poverty. It has ongoing issues with food insecurity. It's been chronically unstable for decades. And now climate change is going to likely affect food and water supply. And you couple that with sea level rises that would displace up to 3 million people, it could really affect regional instability. There's already increasing competition for natural resources such as water and fertile land, and there's tension and conflicts already between communities. And so when that starts happening, people start moving. So people from the country move to the city. But people from the city are already under stress, people from the city are already poor, and ethnic tensions build up in such a way that conflicts then arise. In terms of studies that have tried to look in this, the expectation is also for greater organised crime, drug smuggling, human trafficking, a move to extremism and radicalisation. So within countries that's an issue, but across countries, when people move across borders, it's as much of an issue. So we're watching this area, this space in particular. This is probably the saddest thing. It's likely that while we might be extremely uncomfortable, that our lifestyles can be severely infected. It's people actually in the poorest countries that are just simply going to die. So how are we actually tracking in Australia regarding our emissions? Oops, sorry. So these are emissions, and I'm sorry to say for the last 3 years they've been going up. This is where we're supposed to be. That's what the Australia is actually committed to in terms of Paris. This is the trend line that we're supposed to be operating on. This is where most people think that we need to be by This is the trend line most climate scientists think we need to be running. So we're here, we've got to get to there. I just wanted to use these slides to show a couple of things, and one is that electricity is our largest, because it's very coal dependent, it's one of our largest sources of emission. We do burn a lot of gas in terms of, like, for aluminium smeltering, for example, is directly, it's gas in WA. We've been clearing a lot of land. So in Queensland, unfortunately, we've been clearing a lot of land, and that's been another cause for actually our rising emissions. So it's pretty clear from the science that we need to be reducing our emissions, and there's a notion somehow that it's going to be a really painful process. Well, I promise you, not tackling the problem is also going to be very painful, but there's a lot of upsides to actually tackling emissions control, tackling emissions. For example, if we reduce coal, we know that coal, when it's burnt, produces lots of pollutants that are responsible for heart and lung disease, strokes and cancers, and impacts on the lung development of babies. So weaning off coal and transitioning to renewables would save an estimated $2.6 billion annually in health costs, reduce air pollution responsible for about 3,000 deaths annually, reduce mercury pollution that's actually entering our waters and being caught up in the food chain. So whenever we eat large fish like tuna, we're subjecting ourselves to a little bit of mercury each time. So there are lots of upsides. It'd be pretty good for our economy, personally, I think. There's about $23 trillion that we think are needed for this transition to take place. And I reckon that'd be a good way to try to attract some investments in some renewable technology into Australia so that it could actually promote a new industry. We would have to transition to electric vehicles, improve public transport and reduce air pollution. I don't think that's a really bad thing. We'd have to preserve our forest. I don't think that's a particularly bad thing either. We would have to move to eat less meat. I'll talk a bit more about that, and eat seasonal fruit and vegetables. We'd actually have to change urban design to include more green space, encourage walking and cycling. That's shocking, isn't it? That's really a horrible thing to do. And our buildings would have to be better built, better insulated, that they would actually use less energy. So this is the nitty-gritty here. So what can we do? I really encourage people to talk about this issue. I really encourage people to start talking about it, because the government won't. And I'm not being partisan in any way. Neither party wants to talk about climate change, doesn't want to face to the reality of climate change, but I think we need to talk about the issue. I think we need to reduce personal emissions where possible, and I'll talk about where the best ways are, the best places are that you can reduce your own emissions. Talk about and try and explain to people why you're doing that. Get involved in community action. And this would be great to see. I personally would love people to actually engage with their parliamentarians. So what can you do? Here are my top few suggestions. And I want to actually, this is one that I think is particularly good for Buddhists, because it's not often talked about, but eating a plant-based diet, predominantly, right? I'll tell you why. To feed 7.6 billion people degrades the land and aquatic ecosystems. It depletes water resources, and it drives climate change. So currently, the world's food supply chain contributes, this surprised the hell out of me, 26% of man-made greenhouse gas emissions. So agriculture and our food supply chain creates 26%. Of that agriculture, 83% of farmland produces 60% of agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions. So farmland, cows and dairy consume a huge amount of our resources. So if we could do that one thing of just reducing the meat intake, or perhaps going vegetarian, it would make an enormous difference. Living car-free or just reducing car use is the next big one. Reducing car travel, air travel. If you do travel, you can actually purchase offsets, carbon offsets. Energy efficiency is a good thing, and installing solar panels if you can afford to. And they're really a cost-effective way of doing something, because you get most of that back within about 7 years. If you're running it commercially, your payback on solar panels is closer to 4 years if you're using most of your electricity in the daytime. So I'm gonna end briefly here, and I want to just open up the discussion a little bit more. Do people have any questions for me? Yeah.
What about population control?
Yeah. It's really controversial. The issue about population control, first of all, how am I going to do it, or how are we going to do it, or how is anyone ever going to do it? And there's a whole number of modelling from a man by the name of Hans Rosling around where we're likely to end up in terms of a stable population based on current trajectories. And population growth links very much to health and education. So within countries that get healthier and are more wealthy, they have less babies, all right? And so in poorer countries where, lots of kids die, they actually have more babies because they're hoping that one or two of them actually survive. So as countries get wealthier and as those communities get healthier, they actually have less and less babies. So that's happening around the world, that third world countries, developing countries, are actually progressing, the people are getting better educated and they're getting wealthier, and we're actually seeing declining numbers of births. So with all the modelling that's done, the current projection is that you hit right now at the end of the century somewhere between 10 and 11 billion people as a stable population, actually. So why it doesn't go up, everyone keeps thinking it's going to keep going up and up. Actually, it hits this actual point of equilibrium by the end of the century at around between 10 and 11 billion. And the real question is, can we cope with 10 or 11 billion people? Okay, it's a tough question. Is there any other question? Yep.
What about the farming of animals and eating meat? Is there any other substitute that human beings could eat as food for meat?
Other than eating meat?
Yes, because animals give out carbon dioxide and methane gas.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we don't need very much meat or any meat to be healthy, so there are lots of other current plant-based substitutes in terms of protein. It's just a question on one's palate, actually, as to whether you can tolerate that. And I think things are going to happen, actually, in the next decade or two, where for those that actually enjoy the taste of meat, I expect we're going to find meat substitutes that are going to be very similar to what you're experiencing now, is my thinking.
Well, I noticed that the price of meat is going up.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
Yeah.
So that's going to force a change of people buying expensive meat and so forth.
Possibly. Any other questions? Yeah.
In terms of getting involved in activist groups and trying to stop this terrible tragedy that's happening to us, what do you think about the contribution that Buddhists, with their practice, can do to join that movement and in fact to make it better?
let's be really clear. No amount of actual personal action is going to be sufficient. All right. The thing that needs to happen is our governments to create policies that actually drive the change that's actually necessary, that's actually possible. So we know that this is completely possible to do. We have all the technology there now. What we don't have is political will. So this won't be done by everyone doing their little bit. This will happen only because governments set policies and agendas whereby we make a transition to renewables, we phase out coal-powered stations, we start changing the way our economy actually runs. So everyone, I think, has a part to play. And I left this quote up because it's from Bhante, and he's trying to express something that relates to Buddhist ethics about killing. I personally, I'm going to leave my doctor's hat. I want to speak a little bit from another hat. You know, I'm really grateful because you know, they say of Dharma that that the greatest gift is the gift of Dharma. And I've been fortunate to actually have that. I don't know whether some of you might remember a monk by the name of Seng Tan was his name before he was ordained. He used to come here and actually teach after he was ordained. And he taught me when I was a young kid at 10 or 11 years old, because he used to garden in my mother's home. But there are a number of things for me in terms of the Dharma that the Dharma needs to flourish. So it needs practitioners. And a lot of the focus around what we do within Dharma centres is the promotion of practitioners, that the wheel of the Dharma continues. But to have an order, to have a centre, an order of monks, a retreat space is required, the efforts of many to provide the time, the money and the goodwill. And it helps to live in a country that's free of war and civil unrest. And it helps to have food, adequate water. And if you're fortunate enough to have a retreat space where you can go to the forest and sit at the foot of a tree, then it's really clear that the natural world supports practice. So for me, it would seem that it's only through this network of support, embedded with this web of interconnectedness in this ecology of life, that the Dharma can flourish, right? It's part and parcel of who and what we are. So for me, can we do nothing? So climate advocacy for me means many things. It means maybe speaking or advocating on behalf of a patient, this one earth, that cannot speak and has no hands, yet is as much a part of us as our mouths and our limbs. And I've been waiting for the Dharma to respond. And I don't fully understand why it hasn't, personally. You know, within our ethics, I don't understand why it hasn't, as a Sangha, as a collective, not as individuals. We need to be doing much, much more. The science is absolutely clear. You know, we're facing something that is a challenge to the whole of humanity. There was a question, yes?
Have you written to the environmental minister?
I've written to the Environmental Minister many times, thank you.
How about the opposition?
I've written to the opposition minister many times. I think he would like to hear from huge communities of people that want change and are prepared to stand up and say that they want it. Because the only thing that's going to change is some notion politically that it might actually affect whether they get into government or not. And that will only happen when they suddenly realise that the people that are part of their constituency actually want change. And that won't happen till people actually stand up and start saying that. I mean, not one or two, I mean whole communities. I'm really happy to see that there's someone enthused here. I hope there's others that also are keen. Jonathan, you had a question.
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, it's not a new issue. I mean, and I think for a lot of people, a lot of us have been banging our heads up against the wall for a long time, and almost get burnout in trying to kind of gear ourselves up to do things about this. And I think for me, finding a spiritual path has been, part of that and useful. But how do we kind of, any advice around kind of getting, marshalling our resources to do things?
So we got someone over here that's Friends, what's it called again? Buddhist for the Environment. Okay, so we have some groups forming up here, like Buddhists for the Environment, that actually want to take this further. But what they need is support. They need support from all of you to say that you're actually interested. They need support from the organisation, the actual overarching organisation, to say that they want action also. So they actually need to support so that collectively you can do something, because individually it's really, really tough. And it could also be possible that those groups that form within Buddhism actually join other larger spiritual groups like Australian Response, Religious Response to Climate Change, which is a multi-faith group across all of Australia, of faith groups coming together, because I think we need to hear from the faith groups. We need to hear from spiritual groups around Australia in a really public sort of way to say that this is not acceptable. This is against our ethics and our beliefs. And I think the government needs to start seeing and hearing that. I mean, what are the numbers that are Buddhists? What are the numbers that are within the Christian faith? What are the numbers in the Islamic faith? What happens if collectively they all came together? What happens then? It's a really powerful group. And it's a really powerful group because there's no vested interest. It's not anyone out for anything, for any particular agenda. It's based purely on an ethics, and I think that's the strongest voice that you actually have. I don't understand why we aren't standing up. Yep.
Could you talk about tomorrow at Russell Square, the rally?
So tomorrow there is a campaign called Rise for Climate Action. I think it's what it is. Rise for Climate. It's at 11 o'clock at Russell Square. It'll go on for 2 hours. A lot of the groups there that are for the environment will be meeting, including Buddhists for the Environment, who will have a banner there. They need your support. But as I said, come along and be further informed and join. But really, I would ask you to ask of the people that represent you, in what way can we actually take this further? Yep.
Can I just say that I'm not a young person at all, and my energy is getting as I get older. But what sustains people like me on the path of action is our practice. It's like, I didn't have to practice, I could do it long ago. But it's a practice that is just such a wonderful thing to balance out the action that we need to take.
I think that's another idea that I would put to you, because I work in a funny space. In the advocacy space, I work among environmentalists and activists. They get very angry. You know, they're the people carrying placards. I love them dearly, but they get very angry. And they haven't had the required training to actually stay calm sometimes in more difficult situations. And they burn themselves out a lot. And it would be really great to have a spiritual group come and actually influence how they actually act, that they might actually act from a different place that might have a bit more longevity. So there's a lot of synergies that can come together where we can actually meet in this space, because I think the Dharma has a lot to offer in terms of mind training and the capacity to stay calm and maintain goodwill in difficult times. Yes, Jonathan?
Yeah, a bit of a hypothetical. I mean, it doesn't look very, it's a bad political situation the world over in relation to this issue, and has been for 20 years or so. Me and my friends sit around and talk about, hypothetical situations. I mean, do you think, I guess the question is about consciousness and human, do you think do we need more suffering, do we need more and whether it's to make people, because we've still got deniers in our parliament.
Okay.
So,
Okay, this is change happens. When change happens, it sometimes happens really quickly. So if you actually have been part of other movements or other campaigns, be it, let's say, around smoking, the change is not incremental. People think that when change happens, it happens really slowly and gradually. It actually doesn't. There's certain tipping points that happen when all of a sudden there's a sort of like a mass of people that are for something. And when that tipping point happens, it's like the ball starts rolling downhill. Before then, it's like really hard work. You're pushing uphill to get more and more people to understand the issue. But there's a certain point when that tipping point is reached, change happens really, really quickly. Now, I don't think we're that far away from that tipping point. So if you look at current polling, there's about 50 to 60% of people, it's certainly more than 50%, it's closer to 60% of people that want action on climate change, even if it costs. If you talk about a transition to new renewables, you're talking to 80 to 90% want the transition to renewables. So we're there in one way. We're very, very close in terms of numbers of people that are actually interested. We just need to do that a little bit more, and I think we're close. So if you look also at some of the technologies that are around and the speed and the cost reductions of things like solar power, wind power, it's falling exponentially in such a way that it will become the energy source, not because of any ethical reason, just purely on economic grounds. It will make sense. That's the same way, like right now, it makes much more sense for me to stick panels on my business than actually pay Synergy, because I literally pay back in 4 years' time an investment that will last me 25 years. So based on that alone. So there are many things happening that will drive a change, and when that happens, I think you'll be surprised how quickly. Because the graph we're looking at is at the moment, looks linear, it's slow increments, but actually it's an exponential curve. It starts doing this very quickly. So we're close. So I ask of you to keep going, keep driving, keep making the change happen. Yeah.
There are some people that believe that global warming is partially life, or some people believe that it's actually natural changes in the global temperature. Do you think that it might be actually in between? Like, that there are natural changes happening, plus we're having...
There are multiple number of other causes that cause variation in temperature. Multiple causes, okay? We know very many of them. But if you overlay all the causes onto a graph, you still see over and above that a change that is directly related to carbon dioxide. So yes, there are other changes that happen, and yes, they do influence the temperature, but over and above that, there is a clear relationship that's going on now with greenhouse gas emissions. Yep.
Do you think at times it's a bit too theoretical for some people? Whereas, they're not seeing cause and effect. Like with smoking, you can see the cancer, you can see the dying.
Yeah.
So you can see the obvious, someone smokes, there's that obvious effect, but if you show someone a graph, they can pretty well say, well, that could mean anything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So often
Yeah. I mean, it's a really, we always talk in theoreticals, and I'm trying to actually make it a little bit more real in some of these talks to describe fires and where we're living now and our water resources and the fact that serpentine is where it is. I mean, I'd be surprised if a fire in the next few decades doesn't come close or at the centre. It's a drying climate. The risks are now just multiplying. So I don't know how to make it more real for those that don't believe. Well, if you look at the news in the Northern Hemisphere summers across California, across the UK, in Japan, in terms of just the sheer areas affected, the sheer numbers of people affected, they're pretty scary. They're really scary. Yeah.
He was saying that in America they weren't allowed to use certain words like research-based.
Yeah.
So it sort of it puts evidence out there where evidence is sort of relative.
Yeah.
There's no truth in research in a way, so everyone's just free.
Yeah. It's hard and in a funny, it's not just in the US. We just don't even use the word here. If you try to track climate change in terms of pollies speaking about it, you don't hear the word used. It's been censored. Even amidst the drought of New South Wales, the agricultural minister couldn't even bring himself to consider the possibility that the droughts in New South Wales, as bad as they were, could possibly be due to climate change. He said something like, "Wow, well, that's a far stretch." I mean, it's just absurd, the level of denial that actually goes on. Yep, I do.
Our mindset is so important that we have a positive mindset, for the future, not living fear. This can overwhelm us and we just sort of almost feel crippled. We need to really be positive, and this is where the Dharma helps, whatever religion, whatever spiritual philosophy, to really believe that we can make a difference just through our prayers, our thinking, and our doing.
I think as Dharma practitioners, you're sort of good at holding 2 points of view. All right, the capacity to actually hold and understand something about suffering, and at the same time, the capacity to understand that there's a possibility of liberation. Right, so it's not one or the other. I think we do both. It's impossible to deny some of the changes that are going on, but it should also be impossible to deny that as human beings we can do just about anything if we can put our minds to it. So if you look at what's actually going on, there's some extraordinary advances in terms of technology and what people are coming up with in terms of solutions. And every day there's some new solution, and some of them come out completely out of left field when you weren't even expecting. So we're getting wins, for example, in agriculture now where I wasn't even expecting in terms of cows, in terms of feeding them seaweed, and reducing emissions from cows by feeding them seaweed. Now, that wasn't on the radar at all, and it's come as a big windfall because we weren't thinking that that was going to be an easy place to go to. So, yeah, I think the capacity to hold to a vision and a view and not lose sight of things that are possible is really, really important. And to be able to imagine a future that's possible. Because if you can't imagine a future that's possible, then how can you actually actualise that vision? Yep. Yep, Trish. Good on you. Don't underestimate a visit to a politician. they're very powerful because they know if someone has taken the time to actually go to see them, that this isn't a real issue. So it's much better than signing a digital petition. It's better than a paper petition. It's better than you writing a letter personally to them. It goes, there's an incremental order of which they actually take notice. And the one they take notice most of is actually when someone from within their constituency actually goes up and expresses an opinion. So I would use that as a tool. But again, I would really urge you, if we're going to make change, we've got to come together. We have to come together. We have to come together as a Sangha. We have to come together as a spiritual group. We have to be present and visible and making a statement about what it is that we want for the sake of ourselves, for the sake of the community, for the sake of our children and our future. I'm going to close now because I said I was going to do 1 hour and I've done 1 hour. Thank you very much. Yeah, you can.